Leviticus 13. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, saying, When a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a rising, a scab or bright spot, and it be in the skin of his flesh like the plague of leprosy, then he shall be brought unto Aaron the priest, or unto one of his sons the priests. And the priest shall look on the plague in the skin of the flesh, and when the hair in the plague is turned white, and the plague in sight be deeper than the skin of his flesh, it is a plague of leprosy. And the priest shall look on him, and pronounce him unclean. If the bright spot be white in the skin of his flesh, and in sight be not deeper than the skin, and the hair therefore be not turned white, then the priest shall shut him that hath the plague 7 days. And the priest shall look on him the 7th day, and behold, if the plague in his sight be a stay, and the plague spread not in the skin, then the priest shall shut him up 7 days more. And the priest shall look on him again the 7th day, and behold, if the plague be somewhat dark, and the plague spread not in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is but a scab, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scab spread much abroad in the skin, after that he hath been seen of the priest for his cleansing, he shall be seen of the priest again. And if the priest see that, behold, the scab spreadeth in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprosy. When the plague of leprosy is in a man, then he shall be brought unto the priest. And the priest shall see him. And behold, if the rising be white in the skin, and it have turned the hair white, and there be quick raw flesh in the rising, it is an old leprosy in the skin of his flesh, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean, and shall not shut him up, for he is unclean. And if a leprosy break out abroad in the skin, and the leprosy cover all the skin of him that hath a plague from his head even to his foot, wheresoever the priest looketh, then the priest shall consider, and behold, if the leprosy have covered all his flesh, he shall pronounce him clean that hath the plague. It is all turned white, he is clean. But when raw flesh appeareth in him, he shall be unclean. And the priest shall see the raw flesh, and pronounce him to be unclean. For the raw flesh is unclean, it is a leprosy. Or if the raw flesh turn again, and be changed unto white, he shall come unto the priest. And the priest shall see him, and behold, if the plague be turned into white, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, that hath the plague. He is clean. The flesh also in which even in the skin thereof was a boil, and is healed. And in the place of the boil there be a white rising, or a bright spot, white and somewhat reddish, and it be showed to the priest. And if, when the priest seeth it, behold, it be in sight lower than the skin, and the hair thereof be turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a plague of leprosy broken out of the boil. But if the priest look on, and behold, there be no white hairs therein, and if it be not lower than the skin, but be somewhat dark, then the priest shall shut him up 7 days. And if it spread much abroad in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a plague. But if the bright spot stay in his place, and spread not, it is a burning boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or if there be any flesh in the skin thereof, there is a hot burning, and the quick flesh that burneth have a white bright spot, somewhat reddish or white, and then the priest shall look upon it, and behold, if the hair in the bright spot be turned white, and it be in sight deeper than the skin, it is a leprosy broken out of the burning. Therefore the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is the plague of leprosy. But if the priest look on it, and behold, there be no white hair in the bright spot, and it be no lower than the other skin, but be somewhat dark, then the priest shall shut him up 7 days. And the priest shall look upon him the 7th day, and if it be spread much abroad in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is the plague of leprosy. And if the bright spot stay in his place, and spread not in the skin, but it be somewhat dark, it is a rising of the burning, and the priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is an inflammation of the burning. If a man or woman have a plague upon the head or the beard, then the priest shall see the plague, and behold, if it be in sight deeper than the skin, and there be in it a yellow thin hair, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a dry scall, even a leprosy upon the head or beard. And if the priest look on the plague of the scall, and behold, it be not in sight deeper than the skin, and that there is no dark black hair in it, then the priest shall shut him up that hath the plague of the skull 7 days. And in the 7th day the priest shall look on the plague, and behold, if the skull spread not, and there be in it no yellow hair, and the skull be not in sight deeper than the skin, he shall be shaven. But the skull shall he not shave, and the priest shall shut up him that hath the skull 7 days more. And in the 7th day the priest shall look on the skull, and behold, if the skull be not spread in the skin, nor be in sight deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the skull spread much in the skin after his cleansing, then the priest shall look on him, and behold, if the skull be spread in the skin, the priest shall not seek for yellow hair. He is unclean. But if the skull be in his sight at a stay, and that there is black hair growing upon therein, the skull is healed, he is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. If a man also or a woman have in the skin of their flesh bright spots, even white bright spots, then the priest shall look, and behold, if the bright spots in the skin of their flesh be darkish white, it is a freckled spot that groweth in the skin, he is clean. And the man whose hair is fallen off his head, he is bald, yet is he clean. And if that he that hath his hair fallen off from the part of his head toward his face, he is forehead bald, yet is he clean. And if there be in the bald head or bald forehead a white reddish sore, it is a leprosy sprung up in his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall look upon it, and behold, if the rising of the sore be white reddish in his bald head or in his bald forehead, as the leprosy appeareth in the skin of the flesh, he is a leprous man, he is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him utterly unclean. His plague is in his head. And the leper in whom the plague is, his clothes shall be rent, and his head bare, and he shall put a covering upon his upper lip, and shall cry, Unclean, unclean. All the days wherein the plague shall be in him, he shall be defiled. He is unclean. He shall dwell alone. Without the camp shall his habitation be. The garment also that the plague of leprosy is in, whether it be a woolen garment or a linen garment, whether it be in the warp or woof, or of linen or of woolen, whether in a skin or in anything made of skin, and if the plague be greenish or reddish in the garment or in the skin, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything of skin, it is plague of leprosy, and shall be showed unto the priest. And the priest shall look upon the plague, and shut up it that hath the plague 7 days. And he shall look on the plague on the 7th day. If the plague be spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in a skin, or in any work that is made of skin, the plague is a fretting leprosy, it is unclean. He shall therefore burn that garment, whether warp or woof, in woolen or in linen, or in thing of skin, whether in the plague is, for it is a fretting leprosy, it shall be burnt in the fire. And if the priest shall look, and behold, the plague be not spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything of skin, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing wherein the plague is, and he shall shut it up 7 days more. And the priest shall look on the plague, after that it is washed, and behold, if the plague have not changed his color, and the plague be not spread, it is unclean. Thou shalt burn it in the fire. It is fret inward, whether it be bare within or without. And if the priest look, and behold, the plague be somewhat dark after the washing of it, then he shall rend it out of the garment, or out of the skin, or out of the warp, or out of the woof. And if it appear still in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything of the skin, it is a spreading plague. Thou shalt burn that wherein the plague is with fire. And the garment, either warp or woof, or whatsoever thing of skin it be, which thou shalt wash, if the plague be departed from them, then it shall be washed the 2nd time, and shall be clean. This is the law of the plague of leprosy in a garment of woolen or linen, either in the warp or woof, or anything of skins, to pronounce it clean or to pronounce it unclean. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you that we're able to read your word, Lord, and learn more about you every day, Lord. I pray that we would grow closer to you today than we were yesterday, Lord. And I pray that you speak to us through our pastor today, Lord, as he brings your word to us as you showed him this week, Lord. I just pray that he'd speak with power and fervency, Lord, and present the message clearly so that we our minds may understand, and that we would apply it to our lives, Lord. And I just pray you bless the rest of our day, Lord. Help my dad at work. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Daniel. Leviticus chapter 13. Okay, we're continuing talking about cleanness and uncleanness. This is this passage about cleanness and uncleanness. Last week we talked about how that the mother, when she had a child, was responsible for making sure that she herself was in a state of cleanness in raising this child. She started out every birth, after the birth, in a state of purification. A state of purification to make sure that she reorientated her life towards this child, and that she would be able to physically, of course, to be purified from any physical problems she had from the birth, and then spiritually, of course, to prepare her for being a mother for this child's life, and to raise her properly. And we studied how that having a clean, prepared mother that has purified herself is the best way to start out a child in life, in a life of corruption, and a life that the world can get to you, that you're better off with a family that has a prepared mother to raise that child, and one that has concern for her child, that then would be one who could care less, is not clean. And we studied, of course, and looked at how that there are certain generations that have the proud look and are arrogant against their mother and their family, and they similar to many people where we're not there yet, but we're starting to have this more and more this rebellion against father and mother and so forth, and this lack of submission and so forth. These things are unclean natures. These things are unclean in their nature, and God is trying to show us, hey, this is how you can discover and see what is clean and unclean. And he's doing this through the physical aspects of things that you can see. Remember again that God, creating both the external and the internal, the physical and the spiritual, always has in the physical that you can see with your eyes parables that are that present a spiritual truth. Just like as a farmer going forth to sow a field is a picture of how that he himself spreads the word of God, and how that we as the ground, the earth, receives the seed, the word of God, can grow forth much fruit unto the Lord, who is the farmer, who will one day harvest the earth of those people and so forth. And so we can see the parables that Jesus presents with a spiritual truth. So too in the Old Testament, the physical commandments of God are there to help them in their physical life, but is also there to help them in their spiritual discernment about spiritual ideas, spiritual actions, and so forth. And so we understand that going into this, especially as Christians, understanding the spiritual aspect of a very real and physical world. Here in Leviticus chapter 13, we learn about a disease called leprosy. It starts out on the skin, on the surface, as small little spots. It starts out very small, and you'd be like, oh, it's just a freckle, it's just whatever, I'm just getting gray hairs now, it's just kind of like that. But rather than, it starts to itch, it starts to fester, and basically what this leprosy is in the Bible physically is any disease that spreads in the healthy flesh, causing that flesh to be corrupted and destroyed. So it has to do with the outward, the fleshly, the physical flesh. It's not something that starts on the inside and then works its way out, but rather it starts on the surface. If you know anything about leprosy, it's a virus that is in the environment. And then when you spend time in the environment, and next week we're going to look at chapter 14, where it talks about how that the leprosy can be inside of a house. And then, of course, in this chapter we saw how leprosy can be inside somebody's clothes. And they got to watch out for those things to make sure that it's not in the house, not in the clothes. But if you wear these clothing that has leprosy in it, or you live in a house that has leprosy in it, and you don't clean yourself, you're not making sure that you're being clean, then you will contract the skin disease of leprosy. Now in the Bible, today we have leprosy as its own little disease over here with a particular virus that causes leprosy, causes the limbs to deform and fall off and stuff. But in the Bible, leprosy is basically any disease on the skin that can eat and deform. So it could be a mold, it can be a fungus, it can be a bacteria that eats away at the skin. And people heard about flesh-eating diseases that are from bacteria. You know, somebody's swimming and they get an amoeba or some bacteria on themselves, or MRSA or something, where it'll just eat away at the skin. It started out maybe as a scratch, and then starts eating away, and it's very contagious. And so here in this chapter, we see the physical necessity of containing and stopping the physical disease of leprosy, the physical disease that contracts on and grows and eats away at your skin to grow and fester and cause disease and spread it about. So you can see how that this is very dangerous physically, to allow somebody with leprosy to live in the community and to spread their disease. Now they themselves are innocent of this leprosy. It's not like, I'm going to give myself some leprosy, I'm going to put it on my skin, and I'm going to shake everybody's hand, and it's kind of like today where you get a cold. You don't want to spread a cold, but you get one, and then you might sneeze on a surface, and somebody might touch that surface, and they receive the cold, not on purpose. And so we can see how diseases are transmitted, not on purpose. Now obviously there are people that intentionally transmit diseases on purpose. You have people that have AIDS that they intentionally transmit their disease. They don't care about the other person, like these people that are in alternative lifestyles. They prefer their lust and their desires over containing their disease that they have. And so in society today, that if somebody knowingly transmits to another person AIDS or HIV, they can be put in prison. They can be fined. They can be judged as being guilty of spreading disease. And I think there was a story of a lady called not rheumatoid arthritis, Mary, but I forget the name of the disease that she would carry, but she was a cook. And like in the 1850s or something, I can't remember exactly when, but she was a cook, and she had a disease.
Scarlet fever.
Not scarlet fever, I can't remember what it was. But it was, her name was Mary, and then it was like the disease was the first title, and then Mary. It starts with a B, I can't remember. But basically, she would cook people's food, and then the disease would get on the food. She was a carrier of the disease, but when it got on the food, the plague got in the food, they would die, and then she would go off to somebody else's place and cook food for them, and then they would die. She would go off in somebody else's place, cook food for them, and they would die. It was I forget exactly what the name of it. It'll come to me probably after the sermon, of course. But basically, she knew she had the disease, and so she was told not to cook for people, not to get those type of jobs, because she would spread the disease. And yet she loved to cook, and therefore she continued to cook as a profession. And she was told many times she would go to different towns and she would become a cook, and she would kill the family she cooked for. But she always thought, oh, I can contain it, I can stop it, but she couldn't. And then basically I can't remember exactly what happened to her. I can't remember the story, but I think maybe they executed her or something because she intentionally spread it. And so something. It was I don't think it's not botulism, but I can't remember the story. But her name was Mary and so forth. But so we understand that when somebody does have a festering disease, they need to be put aside from society. They need to be put away, not because they themselves are a wicked and evil person, but because of the skin on the outward part is going to be infectious. It's going to harm somebody else. So that's why we have at times have people that are quarantined to keep them away, not because of their intent to spread, but rather because us as a society need to make sure that they do not spread this disease, and we need to have extreme measures, take away some freedoms and liberties that they have, in order to protect the society as a whole. And this is what was done with this festering disease called leprosy and virus. And this is how that if people had done these quarantines, that people could not spread these disease. And so here in this passage, we have the skin, the leprosy that's in the skin. The priest shall look, verse 3, the priest shall look upon the plague in the skin of the flesh. So it wasn't just an arbitrary person coming up, I think you got leprosy, you need to go away. You know, it's basically whoever discovers it, whether it's the individual, he says, hey, this is not normal. What I have on my skin is not normal. I want to, well, first of all, a person who knows that they have an infectious disease ought to know that they want to be cured of it, and then that they do not want to spread it to others. So it ought to start with them and saying, hey, this is something that is bad in my skin. I need to get rid of it. I need to make sure that I'm not just freaking out. You know, you don't just go to the internet and do a self-diagnosis. No, you need to go to the doctor. So many people go to WebMD and say, well, maybe it's this deficiency. I have this weird feeling right in the side here. Maybe it's an appendicitis. Appendicitis over here, but like appendicitis. I need to do self-surgery. Wait, there's no appendicitis there. I'm bleeding out now. But whoops. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure it was healthy. I was not doing myself. But so you understand that you don't just arbitrarily. Sometimes you can tell that something is wrong, or something's not right. But you don't just arbitrarily do your self-diagnosis. You got to say, hey, there's something going on here. I'm not sure if it's just a regular part. I'm growing old. It's a sunspot. I got a new freckle. I'm just getting gray hair now. I have too many kids that are harassing me in my life. But so we understand that as proper diagnosis is very important in physical diseases, especially, and it's very important not to just take something that we heard in passing to say, oh, this must be that horrendous disease, when it's just a piece of dirt. You need to wipe it off. It's like, but you understand that it's important to make sure that if something's going on, you seek help and you find help. So basically, they go to the priest and they say, hey, is this bad or is this not good? Or maybe a parent brings their child there, or whatever the reason is, they check it out and they see. Now, obviously, we understand diseases today that the best prevention is not to even get involved, to touch anything that has the disease. If you know, that's why I talk about the clothing in the house. If you see it in the environment, then the best way to not get the disease of leprosy is not to be around it, to clean it up, to get it out of your life, to make sure that you yourself are clean, to make sure that before it even you get involved in it, you find out what it is, and make sure that those who you know are experts in. If you see it on the wall, or see it in your clothes, hey, is this some sort of bad thing? If I put this clothing on with this in here, will it harm me, or is it just talcum powder from mom's shoes or something? I don't know. And so you got to check it out. You make sure, first of all, before it even gets close to you, that you have it cleaned out, and then physically you make sure that, hey, if it's on me, that I contain myself, that I am prevented from the greater society. And so verse 10, of course, it says, and the priest shall see him. And of course, this whole chapter is about different situations on figuring out and discerning, especially for the priest, on discerning whether it's a clean or unclean thing. Now remember, clean and unclean is not necessarily whether somebody is good or bad or evil or intentionally trying to harm somebody in this. So you don't go to your patient and say, you have this disease, you're trying to destroy everybody. No, we recognize the disease is the virus, right? The victim is the person that has the virus and is losing their skin. They're victim number one. And then society is going to be victim number two that is not contained. And so in verse 10 it says, the priest shall see him, and behold, if the rising be white in the skin, and have turned the hair white, and there be a quick raw in the flesh, and the rising, obviously raw flesh will spread the disease more than dry flesh. Old leprosy in the skin and so forth. You shut them up 7 days, quarantine, make sure it's not spreading. And they have all these procedures that the priest is supposed to follow to make sure that that is not going to spread. If it's an old leprosy, or if it's new leprosy, or if I'm not sure if this is leprosy, then here's how I contain it to see if it spreads. And we're going to stop and see, even before they know if it is a leprosy or not. Maybe the guy doesn't have leprosy. He still has to be quarantined for 7 days and observed. Even after 7 days and they're still not sure, then he still has to be quarantined for another 7 days. Because it's so serious that if this, you can't be like, well, we're not sure if this is leprosy, so just go ahead and go about your life. Go ahead and do this, and then when we make a final diagnosis, then we'll think about quarantining you. No, it's like, we're not sure of this leprosy, we're going to quarantine you. That was it. It was make sure this doesn't happen. Now remember, we're talking about clean and unclean. First thing we understood is that to keep somebody clean, you need to start out with the mother, start out at birth, because this is a corrupt, evil world filled with evil and so forth. Just as in today, that while this is a wonderful physical world we live in, there are diseases in the environment that are popping up every single day that come into our physical life that are very detrimental to our society. Can destroy people. You know, the bubonic plague destroyed millions of people. You know, and so forth. And so it needs to be contained, and it's treated very seriously. And so here we have determination. It is leprosy, and then there we have to take care of it. Now I have this description that somebody wrote, is that when leprosy first appears on your skin, it begins as a small red spot. Before too long, it gets bigger and starts to turn white, and shining or scaly in appearance, and the scales will fall off and whatnot as the person is consumed by it. Pretty soon, the spots spread over the entire body. The hair begins to fall out from the head, even from the eyebrows. As things get worse, the fingernails and toenails begin to come loose. They start to rot and eventually fall off because of lack of circulation and so forth. The leprosy closes off things. Then the joints and fingers and toes begin to rot and start to fall off piece by piece. The gums start shrinking and can't hold teeth anymore. So each of them are slowly lost. Leprosy keeps eating away at the face until the nose literally falls off the face, like, I was going to say a name, but the nose falls off the face. And leprosy keeps eating away at the face until the nose is literally lost, and the plate and even the eyes rot, and the victim wastes away until they can no longer breathe and survive physically, because it starts with the skin and goes inward, and so it starts on the outward and goes inward. You know, a lot of things, you know, people talk about starting on the inward, going outward, you know, spiritually, but this starts from the environment into the inward. And then the second thing it says, leprosy is like sin in many ways. Many consider a leper as someone already dead. Leprosy is like sin in that it begins as nothing. Oh, this is not a big deal. It's not that big of a problem. It is painless in its first stages. It grows slowly. It often remits for a while, then returns. You know, people struggling with sin. Oh, I'm going to get rid of this bad habit, or this sin, or that, or this problem in my life myself. And then for a while they can resist, and then it comes back, and then and so forth. You understand? So sometimes it remits for a while, then returns. It numbs the senses. One cannot feel it in the affected area. You know how sometimes, a lot of times, spiritually people are like, well, I don't have a problem drinking, and then they do. I don't beat my wife, but when they're drunk and blacked out from memory, they're beating her and so forth. They don't realize it, that they're actually sinning in the process, and they think they have control over it. and it causes decay and deformity. They themselves think, oh, it's not affecting me whatsoever, but people looking outside at somebody who is consumed with sin can obviously see the effects on their life. Consumed with a horrible habit, consumed with a horrible addiction. Like you see guys with meth, those pictures of meth and stuff, their face quite literally is scaly and sores are breaking out because the substance is within their body and it's breaking out on the surface and stuff. And the desire to steal stuff to get money to pay the corner drugstore guy and the drug dealer. And eventually it gives a person a repulsive appearance at the end. And so basically we see that if a lot of times also sins and ideas and things can spread similar to how viruses can spread. And so in the physical, we understand this quite literally, the importance of containing this uncleanness, this horribleness. Now remember again, leprosy in particular is not the fault of the individual. It's not determining their spiritual their spiritual state, but leprosy on the outward part is because they're a victim. They don't understand. They are it's eating away at their physical flesh, physically. And so you need to understand that. It's important understanding the concept of leprosy in the Bible. In verse 45, once it's leprosy, we see that there's precautions that are made. They are no longer just like, well, I got this disease, as long as I don't touch nobody, it's okay, nobody needs to know. No, they have to actually, in their society, be moved, set aside from it, and quarantined, and then they have to look a certain way in order to show people, hey, I have a problem, there is a problem here. Verse 45, and the leper in whom the plague is, his clothes shall be rent. In verse 44, he is a leprous man, he is unclean, the priest shall pronounce him utterly unclean, his plague is at his head. Now remember, it is the priest, and it is the official that pronounces the man unclean. He's the one who makes the determination. He checks it out. He makes sure that he, after doing the procedure, he checked in his manual and he made sure that he's not making a mistake, and he made sure that this person is unclean. He is a leprous man, he is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him utterly, not just somewhat unclean, but utterly unclean. His plague is in his head. And notice that his plague is in his head. Go back to that later. Anyway, I was talking about the forehead bald guy. Just because you have a bald forehead does not mean you're necessarily unclean. But so many jokes I could tell there. But anyway, I'm not going to. Forehead bald. So I always like that. I always like that phrase in the Bible. And the leper in whom the plague is, his clothes shall be rent, his head bare, and he shall put a covering upon his upper lip and cry, unclean, unclean. All the days wherein the plague shall be in him, he shall be defiled. He is unclean. He shall dwell alone. Without the camp shall his habitation be. So that's a pretty hard. It's a pretty hard place to be in your life. No fault of your own necessarily in life. Now, obviously, again, there's ways to. We're talking about clean and unclean. And there are ways to prevent yourself from contracting a virus. Just some people might be, you'll stay home when there's a bad flu outbreak. You'll not be shaking hands when you know you have a cold. You'll try to cover your mouth to make sure that there's steps and procedures to reduce and prevent the spread of viruses. Now everybody take a coughing break real quick. All right. And so we understand these things as a society, but eventually, no matter your precautions, eventually you might contract something that is bad. But here, this leprosy. Now, obviously, there are other viruses, there are other things. This is particularly about leprosy, and he says he shall be utterly unclean. This is not just kind of like the guy's unclean, but rather he's utterly unclean, meaning that if you go around this guy, you're going to become unclean yourself. And so him knowing that he's unclean has to do these things in order for him to continue, to be innocent of malice and spreading the disease. All the days wherein the plague shall be in him, he shall be defiled, he is unclean, he shall dwell alone, without the camp shall his habitation be. And so forth, and then it goes into his clothing and so forth and all that. So he shall dwell alone. A lot of people in the Old Testament believe that the reason why somebody obtained leprosy was because the judgment of God was upon them for some spiritual violation of his law. So if you violated God's law spiritually, he would physically put upon you the disease of leprosy. And majority of times, leprosy was not something they could do to clean themselves. We'll look at this next week when we talk about the cleansing of a leper and how that they can be cleansed of leprosy. But this week we'll just talk about the problem of leprosy itself and the problem of the disease itself. And here we understand that it was not because of some spiritual fault in him that they received this disease, because they're not utterly unclean spiritually, they're just unclean in the physical, right? So the leper is the victim here. He does not necessarily want this in his life. He does not want it there, and yet it is there, and therefore he has to do these precautions to show others, hey, I am leprous, I am diseased, I'm going to dwell alone, not just for my sake, but for the sake of others. Sometimes in your life you're going to do things not for your own sake, but so that others can be better off, especially in the area of becoming unclean and so forth. And that's why the Bible talks about how if a man, like one example, if a man desires the office of a bishop, and then it lists all those qualifications, and then if you are qualified, then you can become a bishop. You can become that thing. But then through no fault of your own, perhaps maybe your husband, no, I was going to say your wife or somebody's like, hey, I absolutely do not want to be a pastor's wife. I'm divorcing you. I'm going away. I've saved myself, and I don't want to. It's no fault of their own. That person loses their wife or something, or maybe he has a bad, horrible habit of being inhospitable. He's rude, he's mean, he's awful, his spirit is bad, but he's a good preacher. No, you have to have all those qualifications. And if it's determined that that person does not have the qualifications, whether before being a pastor or during being a pastor or whatnot, whatever the situation is, then it's up to, because that person is preaching the Word of God and overseeing a church. If that person loses his qualifications or something happens to where in a period of time where he is temporarily unqualified for that office, he needs to step down because of the best, because of the church itself needs to be protected. It needs to be cared for. And so that's why there's such a big deal about pastors in the pulpit who are divorced and remarried or are very rude or mean-spirited people that have not the Spirit of Christ. They perhaps they have the Spirit of Christ in them, but their habit, they have a tendency towards quickly being angry. Maybe the person himself, his nature is that he was endowed with, and he's not disciplining it enough to be long-suffering, to be patient with people. And so we need to realize that, yes, there are good people that are just not qualified. Their ability there for one reason or another is not there through no fault of their own, or because some part of his flesh has been so corrupted in part of his life that he's unable to contain his anger, unable to discipline his children, or one reason or another, he needs to observe himself and say, hey, I have a discipline problem. Hey, I have a spirit problem. Hey, I need to deal with this, and before I can be an overseer of a church, I need to take care of this. I need to be unqualified from the pastor. I've known people that I always thought, hey, you would make a great, wonderful pastor. Why don't you pastor? Why are you just kind of being a regular person in this church? He says, well, I have certain things in my life that I have prayed with the Lord about, and I'm struggling with them right now, and I cannot be a pastor. And outwardly, occasionally the person preaches, he does great ministries in the church or whatever, but and my friend is, a couple of my friends have been this way, is where they were like, oh, I wish that person was a pastor so much. But he says, no, I'm not qualified to be a pastor. This was in my past, or I have this discipline problem, I have this issue in the qualifications that I just cannot do. And so for the sake of the office, they stepped aside. Or they never, even though they desired it, they would never went with it. Now there are a lot of people in the pulpit today that, because of some pride issue in their life, they say, well, I know I'm divorced and remarried multiple times or whatever, and I have this attitude problem. My kids are all evil and undisciplined and stuff. But God's called me to this ministry, and God's called me, and it's only God that's going to stop me from doing it. And this is my ministry, and you can see the arrogance in their attitude towards this, that they refuse to step down. They refuse to, even though they're not qualified, they refuse to, they make justifications for it. Those people that they know that they're not qualified for that office are in rebellion to God. And so you've got to be careful with certain people. And so we understand that while there are people that realize, hey, I'm not qualified for this office to be a pastor, and especially a lot of people that I've talked to, we have some good friends at Green Meadow that I'm like, man, you should be a deacon. You're so awesome. You do all these great things for the church, and you have these qualifications. You're so qualified to be able to do what you do. Why aren't you a deacon? Well, 30 to 40 years ago, this happened in my life, and I personally feel that I would not be qualified to be a deacon. And everybody else around is like, hey, but what about this? No, that person says, hey, I'm not clean. I don't have this. So we understand that even through no fault of their own, or because they are unable to get victory completely over a certain area of the qualifications, to where they can have peace about it, and those outwardly can have peace about it, that they know that if they got into that ministry, that they would cause some uncleanness to come upon the ministry. And so we need to be to realize this in our own lives, that just as in spiritually, through no fault of their own, or physically through no fault of their own, and through prevention, even if perhaps they tried to prevent it, that they contracted this disease of leprosy, that they themselves would be the ones to rend their clothes and put a cloth over their upper lip and shout, unclean, unclean, to other people, because they care about other people. They themselves, not wanting to spread the disease to other people, are not going to be sneaking around town and saying, well, I'm just as clean as everybody else, and I can be in this town just because I want. I'm part of this community. Nobody's going to stop me from being here. I was born here, and you guys, I'm more of this town than you are, and all this stuff. No, what is this society supposed to do? Get out of the camp. Not like they were cut off from the people. They were just out of the camp. They were just not qualified to be in town. And so too it is with the spiritual life of us. We, from birth, need to be trying to help our children to understand the difference between being clean and unclean. Understanding that just because you have a tendency to be soon angry, you need to put that under discipline, because if you allow your attitude or your spirit in anger or short-temperedness to fester and continue, that's going to lead to sin. That's going to cause you to be unclean. But if you're like, hey, I'm going to be whatever, and I'm going to just have an attitude however I want, then you're going to become utterly unclean, because you're going to let that attitude have full reign in your life. You're not disciplining it. You see, that's the thing, is that there are things in your nature that if you do not subject them daily, that will cause and rise up within you to cause you to become unqualified, unclean, and though you yourself later on in life may desire to have rule over it, it's a struggle and daily battle with you that you are no longer qualified to give advice in certain areas, to do certain things. You know, a lot of people that when they were lost struggled with music. And so they were like heavy metal or this or that or the other thing. So to where that now that they were saved, in order to have victory over it, they will not even be a song leader. They know that their taste in music is not appropriate for the church. Or they might say, hey, you know, I don't have good discernment in that area, and so forth. And so they would make sure that they were not the ones in charge of that, and so forth. So here we have in this passage, obviously, physically unclean, but just because they are physically unclean does not mean that, oh, you're forsaken, you're abandoned, you are no longer worthy to be around me. Like the Pharisees, they would look at you and say, hey, you're not qualified to be a pastor, or you're not qualified to be a Christian. Goodbye. You know, that's kind of the way their attitude would be. If you are struggling in a certain area and you're not perfect, then we ought not to have anything to do with you. You know, that is kind of the way people treat people that are unclean through no fault of their own. Okay, and so leprosy here is while it is somewhat a picture of sin, it is more of a picture of uncleanness that you yourself are not able to control. There are things in your life that you are for lack of a better term, a victim to, that are part of your life now. You cannot just ignore them. You cannot just say, hey, this is in the past and it's always the past. Well, yes, of course, God forgives your sin, but that does not mean that you are completely clean in the flesh. You know, your baggage follows you in that sense. That in your bad habits and in your nature until you can be fully get a new body from Christ in heaven. The reason why I understand this not to be necessarily sin in your life necessarily, but rather that you being a victim of your circumstances in that you have become unclean through no fault of your own necessarily. Now I say necessarily because, like I said, there's prevention things and so forth that perhaps maybe you could have had in place, but maybe you just did not know about them, or maybe you were not as spiritually as you could have been in the past, and that these things have gotten control over you before you became the spiritual giant that you are now. So here we have two examples that this is not like just because you're utterly unclean does not mean that you're utterly lost in sin, utterly destroyed. Is that in Matthew chapter 8, verse 1 through 4, we see that Jesus Christ himself loved the lepers. You know, the Pharisees were like, oh, the lepers our judgment of God is upon them, and we should not even associate with them. They can't do anything for God anymore. Matthew chapter 8, we see that Jesus himself hung out and cleansed lepers. It was not something that they could, it's very hard to cleanse yourself of leprosy, and very rarely did it happen, but there are people in the Bible that had victory over leprosy and were able to live a normal life once again. And we'll deal with that a little bit more next week. So Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, says, when he was come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him, and behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. You see, the problem with leprosy in your life, especially something that is a habitual bad problem in your life, if you try to clean it up yourself, turn over a new leaf, you're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be qualified. You're never going to be qualified for anything if you try to do it and take care of it on your own. But if you come to the Lord, there are certain people, there are certain qualifications where at this time, presently, perhaps maybe you're not qualified for the ministry, but when God gives you victory over certain things in your life, while there are certain things in your past or your life that once they happen, you cannot do anything about them, there are other things in your life that you can get victory over to be better service to the Lord. Behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. And Jesus put forth his hand, and he touched him, saying, I will, be thou clean. See, perhaps maybe you're not qualified for a certain area, you're not qualified to do certain things, but you're still able to do the service of the Lord, and so forth. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. The area in which he had the disease was cleansed. So, while sometimes a festering disease, whether spiritually or physically, is in your heart, maybe a bad habit, maybe a festering sin that you don't have victory over, maybe sometimes you can pray to the Lord and that leprosy will be cleansed. Now, I know certain people, they have testimony. Now, this is not testimony or proof necessarily of whether they're saved or lost, but it used to be that you oftentimes hear these testimonies of, well, I used to be a heavy drinker, or they list some sort of bad vice that they had, or struggle that they had as a lost person for one reason or another. And then when they got saved, God just immediately gave them victory in a certain area. Now, that's not a proof of their salvation, but rather that is just kind of something that God did for them personally. Here's a guy who worshipped him, and immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Immediately, something in your life can be taken away. Sometimes you're like Paul the Apostle, a great man of God, but then he had a thorn in his flesh that God would not remove for one reason or another, and it was not immediately. So you need to realize that, yes, you can get victory over certain aspects of your life that you previously did not have victory over if you seek it through prayer and fasting. But sometimes God says, no, I want you to be unqualified or a certain level of uncleanness for my purposes. Just like as Paul had a thorn in the flesh for the Lord's purposes was not removed. So we need to understand that just because you have, perhaps you're not qualified for the pasture. That's an easy one to give an example of for one reason or another, and you've prayed, Lord, make me qualified. Lord, help me to be qualified. And God says, no, the office is not for you. I want you to have something else. Maybe I want you to be a servant in the church. Maybe I want you to do something else with your life. There's something greater for you that I want than for you to be a pastor. Just because every good man of God is not qualified to be a pastor does not mean that he is disqualified from the service of the Lord. In fact, here is a leper who was not qualified to be in the community, but then he sought the Lord's help, and the Lord says, I will, be thou clean. You never know what victory you'll have over if you go to the Lord and seek it to be cleansed from it. And Jesus said unto him, see that thou tell no man, but go thy way and show thyself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for testimony unto them. So testimony unto them. And so the reason why that we need to do these things, one of the reasons why is a testimony for the priest. A lot of times when a pastor is dealing with you and struggling and stuff, a lot of times people in counseling, they struggle with something. Instead of getting right with the Lord, they go off and indulge in it and become utterly unclean in their life. But when you are able to have victory over a situation spiritually in your life, or physically, or a bad habit in your life, and you're able to have victory over it, and you come to the pastor and say, hey, God gave me victory on this, and you give your testimony and so forth, it's a great blessing to people like me that say, hey, there's a victory in the power of Jesus. You can have victory there. It's a testimony to the church that here once he was utterly unclean in this area, and God gave him victory. Where somebody was a heavy drinker and beat his wife, and God gives them victory and turns them from that, becomes a great peaceful man in his life. God gives you victory in certain areas. And so in the order of uncleanness and so forth, we see how these people can be cleansed. But here, let's look at another example. Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 17. Verse 11 through 19. And it came to pass, as he went to Jerusalem, that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. He entered into a certain village. There met him 10 men that were lepers, which stood afar off. And they lifted up their voices and said, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. And when he saw them, he said unto them, Go show yourselves unto the priests. It came to pass that as they went, they were cleansed. And one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back and with a loud voice glorified God, and fell down on his face and the feet giving him thanks, and he was a Samaritan. And he fell down on his face and his feet giving thanks, and he was a Samaritan. And Jesus answered and said, were there not 10 men cleansed? Were there not 10 cleansed? But where are the 9? There are not found that return to give glory to God, save the stranger. And he said unto them, arise, go thy way, thy faith has made thee whole. So you can have victory over those areas in your life that are festering and consumed. And when you do, when God gives you a victory in the area of your disease or your struggle or whatever it is, you ought to turn around and glorify God and praise Him and thank Him and let it be known to the church and to the pastor so that it can be a blessing and a testimony. You know, so many times God helps and cleanses somebody of a certain problem in their life, and they keep complaining. They keep on acting as if nothing has happened in their life. And God says, were not there 9, or there were 10, and yet only the stranger comes along and gets cleansed. You know, so oftentimes somebody who lives a horrible life before they're saved gets saved, and immediately God cleanses them, and He gives praise to God. And then there's 9 people that lived in the church not qualified to do anything. Then God makes them qualified, and they ignore the whole thing. You know, so they give them a victory in a certain area, but then they still don't have. God cleansed 10, but only 1 isn't realizing that he's been cleansed, and praise God for it. And so we need to, as people that have gotten victory over certain areas of our life, need to thank the Lord every time He gives us victory somewhere. Need to say, hey, now that I'm qualified, what more can I do for the Lord? God gave me this great gift. How can I get better for it? And so we see here in this passage, of course, leprosy is that picture of uncleanness that has utterly consumed a person. Some area that, remember, if you start out as a little child and your mother is intentionally raising you to be a clean person and sanctified, set apart for the Lord, then you're resisting disease or resisting corruption and you're qualified and so forth, then you can have victory in areas that people that did not have a clean life cannot have victory over. People have struggled with addictions because they were taught them at home. People are struggling with anger and rebellion because they were taught them at home. People are struggling with all these things. So if you have a good godly family that raises children properly, that do not suffer their children not to come to the Lord, they grow up with the Lord in their life, then they're going to have a clean life to be able to be a clean vessel unto the Lord, whereas somebody who struggled in life does not have that same opportunity. Yet those 9 people living a clean life that God has cleansed and taken care of them, they're not grateful. How oftentimes you hear about evangelists, A, B, C, or D, talks about his old life that God saved him from, and he has victory over this, and because God cleansed that man, he was able to give great testimony. You know, the Bible talks about how that those who have been cleansed of a little love a little, but then those who have been cleansed of much love much. And so we ought to, especially myself as a Christian who has been raised in a good and godly family, who's been given great ideals, needs to realize I have more responsibility. But a lot of times, those Christian kids are part of the 9. They don't go off and thank the Lord that they don't have the struggles that many other people do, so that they can serve much more. And so we need to realize and be thankful for the areas that God has given us victory over. And looking into these things, and before we go, is that we need to understand that sin and uncleanness are things that we can. Sometimes we don't have victory over them. We don't have a choice that we have that struggle in our life, but we need to realize that it is not something that precludes you from being saved. Now, in the Bible, of course, there's 2 sorts of things. And here we're talking about, in the body, it's talking about leprosy, which is a physical outward disease that affects you, even though you yourself are spiritually are not there. A few other things. The Bible also talks about leaven being a similar thing as leprosy. Just as leprosy starts out small and grows and consumes, so too leaven, which is kind of like baking powder or something, or like a yeast, will start out small and utterly consume the thing that it's in to cause it to become puffed up and so forth and things. And so there are things in your life that if you allow them to grow, at first they're small, it's not a big deal, if you allow them to grow, can cause destructive force, not only in your own life, but in the lives of others. Some examples of this can be found in, and let's take a look at Matthew chapter 16, verses 6 through 12. Matthew chapter 16. Verses 6 through 12. It says here, "Then Jesus said unto them, Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees." Just as spiritually, physically, leprosy can spread from one person to another, and you need to take heed lest you get leprosy on your skin. So too in your heart, spiritually, you can contract some things. Whether perhaps you're saved, you're a believer, and you're doing the will of the Lord. But there are things even in Christian circles, or religious circles, if you will, that can cause you to be ineffective to the Lord. And the big thing in Jesus' time was the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Outwardly, very spiritual people. Today, outwardly, very spiritual people are going to affect your lives, either through books, TV, radio, and all sorts of nature. And we need to realize that Jesus says, "Take heed and beware the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees." And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "It is because we have taken no bread." Which when Jesus perceived, he said unto them, "O ye of little faith, why reason ye among yourselves, because ye have brought no bread? Do ye not yet understand, neither remember the 5 loaves of 5,000, how many baskets you took up?" It's not about the physical I'm telling you about. He says, verse 11, "How is it that you know not understand? I spake not unto you concerning bread, that ye should beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees." Verse 12, "Then understood they how that he bade them not to beware of the leaven of the bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees." There are good men out there that are saved and they're blessed of God in their ministries perhaps, but they have a doctrine, a leaven that is in their life that perhaps no fault of their own. They've learned it of their other people, kind of like how Paul was a disciple of Gamaliel. His life was raised as a Jew, and so here he is being pricked in the heart in the New Testament about what he's doing to the Christians. He's being pricked into the heart spiritually, but because of the leaven that was in his life from the Pharisees, that he was going around crucifying and harming and persecuting the church of God. What was wrong with Paul in his life? Was it because he was a good or bad? Was because he was an evil man? No, the reason was because he had the leaven of the Pharisees in his life, causing him to harm the church of Christ. And once Christ appeared to him, he repented and he got the victory over that thing. But the thing is that the doctrine in his life was causing him to persecute others. Sometimes there are good people in this life. There are good people that maybe they're saved, they're going to heaven, but because of the bad doctrine they've been spoon-fed, is that they've contracted spiritual leprosy. They've contracted something that is harming them, their spirit towards other people. There are a lot of people that know the Word of God, but because of the bad doctrine that they've got, they see the Word of God in a wrong light, and they have malice in their heart towards others. Paul the Apostle, before he was converted to Christ, was a good man, thinking that he was doing God a service. And yet, because of the leaven of the Pharisees in his own heart, he was causing malice to others. He was persecuting the church of Christ. So we need to be aware of the doctrines. I always say this, is that if a doctrine seems good on the surface, but it leads you to do the work of the flesh, then it's not a good doctrine. If you take it to the extreme and it causes you to have hatred in your heart for your fellow man, it's not a good doctrine. There's something wrong with it. There's leaven there. If that doctrine seems good on the surface, but then you take it to its end extreme, and then it ends with heresy and wickedness, it's not a good doctrine. If it ends with divisive doctrineness, whereas Arminian and Calvinism becomes this battle among Christianity, forcing people to have each other, that's leaven. That is wickedness. In itself, the sovereignty of God. Oh, that sounds wonderful. That sounds great. Oh, the responsibility of man to serve the Lord in Arminianism. Oh, that sounds wonderful. That sounds great. But then taking these two extreme in these doctrines, it becomes leaven, it becomes spiritual leprosy that causes malice in the heart of individuals towards their fellow man. What's the Bible say? To be dwell at peace with men as much as lieth within you, to be at peace with one another. Not to accept their evil doctrines, but rather to make sure that you are at peace with the Lord and not accepting these things. So we understand that there is a spiritual leprosy of doctrine that you can oftentimes get consumed by through no fault of your own, because you've been spoon-fed it like the Apostle Paul. Mark chapter 8, verse 15. Mark chapter 8, verse 15. Mark chapter 8, verse 15 says, "And he charged them, saying, Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." A good example of that is that there is oftentimes that people that are very good men, they allow their ministries to be taken over by politics. They allow themselves to be consumed by the political arena. Their politics no longer become proclaiming the Word of God, but they themselves may be saved and Christian and worthy to serve the Lord and qualified in all of the other areas, but then they start having this politics hobby horse of fighting against the government, of either promoting a party above another, or trying to have partisan politics and causing their bully pulpit to be for Herod or against Herod. You know, I as God's minister ought not to allow the leaven of Herod to seep in, the leaven of politics, the leaven of government, the leaven of what area of politics that I desire to be in through the flesh and so forth, but I should be a minister of Christ. I should not allow the leaven of Herod to creep in to my doctrine. I should not allow patriotism, while I feel to be a patriotic American. I don't think it's necessarily right or wrong to have flags in the church, but we've chosen not to have flags in this church because this church is not an American church. This church is the church of Christ. This is the church of God. This is God's church. We don't have the Christian flag here because well, if you know the history of that flag, it's made by the Catholics, I believe. I'm not quite sure. I haven't looked into it for a while. But we choose not to have a political church. We're not going to preach about the politics of the Middle East or whatever. And so we're not going to be preaching the exaltation of a nation above another. We're not going to be preaching the exaltation of America above other nations. We're the beacon of hope. We're the beacon of light. No, we need to preach the word devoid of the leaven of politics of Herod, politics of Babylon, politics of the world. We need to preach the whole counsel of God. And so here in this verse we see that he says not only be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees, but also the leaven of Herod. That was your Herodians that were Romanized Jews and so forth. Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. Don't allow politics, the doctrine of politics, to determine your place. You know, a lot of very Republicanized churches out there preaching Republican ideals and not Christian ideals. There are very social justice churches out there that are preaching, while they themselves preach Christ and so forth, they have the leaven of democratic social justice politics that ought not never to be. Another one, Luke chapter 12, verse 1. Matthew, Mark, Luke chapter 12, verse 1. Says, in the meantime, when they were gathered together, innumerable multitude of people, insomuch that they trode one upon another, he began to say unto the disciples, first of all, beware ye of the leaven of the Pharisees, and which is hypocrisy. It's basically believing one thing in the Bible, but then doing another. It's basically saying that you are doing one thing, and yet in your heart doing another. You need to be honest with yourself in the things that you do. You should not allow the leaven of hypocrisy to come into your heart. If you have a problem with something, be honest about it. If you have a problem in doctrine, be honest about it. If you have a difference of an opinion, be honest about it. Now, I'm not saying to be forcing and promoting your own ideals and stuff, but what I'm saying is that when you struggle with a certain thing, be honest about it. If you're not sure about a certain thing, don't just go along with the crowd. Don't just say, well, everybody in my circles believes this thing, and therefore I'm going to pretend I believe that thing. I'm going to not... No, you need to be honest with yourself and others around you about who you are and what you struggle with. You cannot be saying, well, everybody, if I have this secret sin in my life, and if everybody heard it in the church, then they would judge me because they're legalistic, or they have the certain standards, they have this thing. So oftentimes we feel pressured to conform to a certain ideal and a certain standard in the church because we have this idea that everybody else conforms to it. Everybody's ultra spiritual, but inwardly everybody's all scared and insecure as everybody else. Wonder what everybody else thinks about them. If I reveal this to my brothers and sisters in church, they'll think less of me. I'll do all these less things. And outwardly, of course, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Outwardly, they look these ultra super people, and I being a poor publican, I'm afraid to say, be merciful to me, a sinner, because if they saw the sin in my life, they would be, I'm better than that publican. We ought not to have that. We need to have a measure of honesty about who we are and what we struggle with in our life, because we need to be very careful about that, because while I might be strong in one area, you might be strong in another. While I might be weak in another area, you'll be weak in another. And if we are not honest with one another, we're going to allow these fake standards that we make up in our own mind about other people that they would think about us to get in the way of having a strong, supportive church. Because if you're weak in an area, I can strengthen you rather than say, oh, you're weak in that area, ha. Ye that are spiritual, restore such a one. So we need to be careful the hypocrisy in our own lives, the leaven. We don't while they're good, godly people, sometimes we allow the hypocrisy in our own lives and others' lives to control how we act around each other and with others, and how we model our own Christian life. We as Christians, whether in doctrine or in good deeds or in struggles, should never be hypocrites, because that is a leprosy. Hypocrisy is a leprosy that even though good Christians can get caught in through no fault of their own. They need to be honest about themselves. They need to be sincere. Another one, we'll run out of time here, of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Now you can read this chapter later on. It's a common chapter that I've referred to a few times. It's about the man who was caught having an affair with or married his father's wife or whatever, and that it was wrong, it was evil, and the church was glorifying in it. And Paul was saying, hey, don't glorify in this, even though you have liberty. Don't you know a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6. fornication among you, that one should have his father's wife. Ye are puffed up and have not rather mourned that ye had done this deed, might be taken away from you. We need to be careful of sin, because if we glorify, well, he's saved, he's a Christian, even though he's a sinner and he's glorifying in his sin, we got to say, hey, no, we need to have this evil taken away from us. For verily absent in body and present in spirit have judged already as though I were present. Verse 4, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, when ye are gathered together, my spirit and power in Jesus Christ. Verse 5, deliver such a one unto Satan for destruction of his flesh. See, we should never allow flesh to determine our spiritual condition, that the spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. Your glorying is not good. Do not glory in sin. Do not say, well, I'm saved by the grace of Jesus, so it's okay if I'm a sinner. No, you need to purge out. Your glorying is not good. Know ye not that a little leaven hath leavened the whole lump. You know, we ought not to be a fleshly people. If we're allowing our flesh to control our actions, even if we're Christians and saved, then we are allowing leprosy to enter into our lives. We will become unclean if we allow that flesh not to be subjected. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. So if you cannot get rid of the leprosy spiritually in your life through the hypocrisy, through the doctrine, through the politics, and then through the flesh, if you're allowing these things to creep in to your own life, then we as Christians need to say, hey, you're not dealing with this, you know, you're not open about this, and you refuse to get it right. You see, just like that person who has leprosy but refuses to go through the process, refuses to be humble about it, refuses to tell others about it, that they're to be cast out. Because why? We care about the lump. We care about the whole. The leprosy has to be quarantined. We need to make sure. We need to go through that Matthew chapter 18 process. He says, therefore let us keep, I wrote it to you that, and then verse 9, that ye an epistle not to company with fornicators, and not altogether with fornicators of this world, with covetous or extortioners or idolaters, for then must needs go out of the world. But now I have written unto you that not to keep company of any man that is called a brother, be a fornicator. You see, these problems of leprosy are not about people that are without the camp, that are not part of us, but are about brothers. Leprosy is contracted with brothers. Leprosy is contracted by people in the community by a disease from without, causing that person that is already saved to cause harm to the community as a whole. Because while we as Christians may be saved ourselves, our leprosy, our leaven, can cause people to not be saved. That's why we're not worldly Christians. That's why we're sanctified, so that we can draw people out of the world, not make them lose the opportunity of salvation. But I've written unto you to keep company with him who is called a brother, be a fornicator, covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, which such and one know not to eat. Don't have fellowship with that, because that's going to rub off on you. For what have I to do with judge them also that are without? Do not ye judge them that are within? But them that are without, God judgeth. You got to be careful being judgmental about everybody in the world. You got to be concerned with those that are within. Therefore, put away from among you yourselves that wicked person. See, the person was wicked, even though that they were called a brother. And so we need to realize that if you're utterly unclean spiritually, you may be saved, but you're going to be handed over to Satan for destruction of your flesh, wherein is the sin, so that your spirit will be saved, and the rest of us will be saved, and there'll be a whole new lump. Galatians chapter 5, and we'll end with this, even though we ought to be ending 15 minutes ago. Galatians chapter 5, verse 9. Let's see. Talking about the leaven of the Old Testament, allowing the Old Testament to determine your New Testament relationship with Christ. And you can read the rest of the chapter later. It's talking about leaven of allowing the Old Testament to determine your spiritual life. And verse 6, for in Christ Jesus neither circumcision availeth anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith which worketh by love. We should allow faith to work us out in us love, not hatred or malice or envy, which leprosy causes. even though that person themselves perhaps may be saved spiritually. This person, ye did run well, who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth? This persuasion cometh not of him that calleth you. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. I have confidence in you through the Lord, that ye will be none otherwise minded, but he that troubleth you shall bear his judgment, whosoever it shall be. We need to realize that there are struggles in our life. If we hide them, and if we say, oh, this may be leprosy, this may be detrimental to the community, but I'm going to just keep on living it. I'm not going to quarantine myself. I'm not going to protect myself. I deserve to be a bishop. I deserve to be this or that. I deserve to be a teacher in the church, even though I'm teaching about something I have to struggle with. No, you need to take care of that thing. You need to identify it and quarantine it, lest it break out into the community as a whole. And so that's why you as a person understanding the difference between clean and unclean, even you as a Christian who has an uncleanness in your life, you need to make sure that that thing's quarantined in your own life before it gets out to the community, just as is a lot of problems in this life, false doctrine, politics, and all these things. You need to quarantine that thing. You need to get rid of it. And so we as Christians, we need to be a clean people and not allow this spiritual leprosy to affect us as a whole. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you, blessings you give to us, Lord. I pray that you'll continue to guide and help us. Help us to be a clean people and understand the importance of, even if we're saved, to subject the flesh and not allow it to contract a spiritual leprous problem in our lives that cannot be controlled before it utterly become unclean. Lord, I know you can give us the victory over this. You love us. You care about us even in our corrupted state. Help us to be holy unto you. In Jesus' name.